Hello and welcome to Eco Echoes, a climate dialogue. We're two friends who are breaking down the buzz around climate and ESG topics, making them accessible and engaging for everyone, from the climate-curious beginners to seasoned professionals. Welcome to Eco Echoes.
This episode is presented in collaboration with the UBC Sauder Centre for Climate and Business Solutions. From the mountains to the sea, this is the conversation around energy.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. As you can see, bit of a change today, but we are...
As they can see.
They can definitely see us. But yeah, we're in a studio and we can actually see us, not just hear us today. And so it's a pretty special episode. We decided to come in to the UBC Sauder studio here and have this conversation. Thanks to the support of the UBC Sauder Climate and Centre for Climate and Business.
Center for Climate and Business Solutions.
Thank you. But yeah, jumping into today's episode, I thought this was a very topical one. It's a topic that I'm interested in, and it's something that's in the news as well. And so that's why I thought it would be a good time for us to hop in, have a chat about it. And obviously, the thing that was very much in the news is about trade barriers and how it relates to electric vehicles. In a past episode, we did touch on a little bit about some of my experience seeing electric vehicles around the world and kind of their proliferation. However, in Canada and the US, we're kind of seeing almost like a bit of a resistance when it comes to trade vehicles coming from abroad. And so I'm curious to hear from you, like what's actually happening in the background that's causing all the recent policy changes around trade and trade barriers, let's say, when it relates to EVs. I saw some really big headlines about like tariffs going up, like a big percentages.
Yep.
It seems like a big scary thing. What's actually happening? I want to learn. I'm here to learn from you essentially today, as usual.
So I think a lot of this goes back to geopolitics, and in particular the relationship of the United States and China, and how that politically has formulated over the last, let's call it like 8-9 years kind of thing. So the last couple years of the Obama administration into the years of the Trump administration, and then into the Biden administration. So over that period of time, one of the things that's happened, right, and I think we've talked about before, the biggest kind of implementer of solar technology across the world is China in terms of a country, right? Yeah. So one of the ways that China has been able to facilitate that is a lot of the manufacturing for solar technologies has been placed in China. And so there was a shift in the Chinese economy over the last couple of years. And so one of the things that happened was that China started to send the kind of in particular, the solar technology that they could not sell domestically abroad, and they started to sell it at a significant discount to anything that would be profitable within the country itself. Okay. So consequently, we would have then in North America, in particular, all sorts of installers importing solar panels, right, because they're super cheap, and then installing them, and then effectively supporting the Chinese economy as a result. And what's then been positioned, and this is how the Obama, the Trump, and the Biden administration kind of play into it, is it's been to the detriment of American manufacturing. And so consequently, there were kind of trade tariffs that I think were initiated under the Trump administration. Okay. And then Biden has sort of accelerated that. So
it's now gone beyond.
That's right.
Solar
panels,
if it's going to
EVs. So it started out with solar, and then it's kind of expanded to a variety of clean energy technologies, of which the probably most prolific is electric vehicles or EVs. And I think the original tariff, the way that it was put together, was roughly 25% to 25% import tariff that the United States imposed on China for electric vehicles. And as of quite recently, like as in just a few days ago, they increased that proportion from 25% to 102.5%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that's going to have a big impact on those imports. And I guess looking at the U.S. Economy, import-export, when it relates to solar panels and or EVs, were there that any imports coming from just China? Like, is the... I don't know how much you know about like that landscape or the breakdown of where the different or the different countries they're importing from, I guess. Was
Right.
China such a big proportion that it's actually kind of causing a bit of a
Well,
concern or stir?
one of the other pieces around this is that it wasn't necessarily a direct import, right?
Okay.
So one of the ways that it seems that China was able to get around tariffs for at least a period of time was to send that technology to a second country, most of them I think in Southeast Asia, and then those Southeast Asia countries being the exporters to the United States. So then effectively it's technology that's being imported from, let's say, Vietnam instead of being imported from China.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but now is that the strict tariff now apply to those like third countries? Like, do you know enough about that? Or
I don't think so.
Okay.
And at least not to the scale that it is to specifically China.
Okay. So yeah, I mean that's interesting. And so one thing I also want to get clarity on is, so the tariffs have gone from 25% to 100% on things from China on, let's say, EVs, or is it just EVs, or is it like EVs and other
Clean manufacturing
technologies? Interesting to kind of see that. Like, as we look at that specifically and look at the implication that that's going to have on the U.S. economy, I guess, and our adoption of that technology, like, what do we expect to happen? And I guess the other question is, like, the U.S. wasn't already a big adopter? Like, at least we didn't used to see a lot of like Chinese EVs in the U.S. anyways.
Yeah.
So why is this even a thing if the actual cars like BYD or these other brands from China weren't already in the market? I'm just curious.
I think this is how kind of the clean manufacturing kind of piece ties into broader geopolitics, right? Because I think a lot of the tariffs that were put into place because of a lot of the migration of manufacturing jobs to that part of the world, just in general, not as it applies to clean energy manufacturing, but over the last number of decades, right? A lot of, in particular, U.S. manufacturing jobs, Canadian manufacturing jobs have been pushed to that side of the world, to the benefit of that side of the world and economies on that side of the world, and to an extent to the detriment of the U.S. of Canada.
Manufacturing.
Yeah.
And then, like, what do we expect to happen looking at the cost of EVs in the U.S. when it comes to this? Like, for I guess for locally, even for the local manufacturers. I mean, as of 2022, so the Biden administration pushed forward this piece of legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act, and we've talked about this that
before.
many times.
And the Inflation Reduction Act was intended to, one of its intents is to help scale up clean manufacturing in North America. Right, in particular in the States, but Canada managed to squeeze themselves in there. And so what the intention then is for the demand for electric vehicles that exists in North America and is in a sense expected to scale up or at least increase for EVs over the next many number of years and decades, that those vehicles will be coming from manufacturers and factories in Canada, in the United States. So that means that what will happen is that you'll have car manufacturers, of which some originate in China. In fact, the largest manufacturer of electric vehicles, and we've talked about this before, is BYD, or Build Your Dreams. We don't have any of those vehicles in North America, right? And yet, if you look around the world, BYD is prolific in most areas of the world. You will see that brand all over the place. And so what I expect to see is that if these tariffs are maintained, even decreased a little bit, or at least like the status quo in a sense maintained, is that we will continue to see that. We'll just see a scale up of manufacturing in North America. We'll see that demand for EVs in North America fulfilled by North American manufacturing, and then we'll see the scale up or continual scale up, or at least maintenance of the manufacturing base in China, in Asia, serving effectively like potentially the rest of the world,
other geographies. It's interesting to think about, because I mean, with these tariffs, they're almost like blocking, like by kind of starting this like, let's say, a trade war in a sense. Like, my understanding is like a big market for Tesla was China, for example.
That's right. And
so when now the U.S. is increasing these tariffs in the U.S. to block potential EV manufacturers to sell their cars here, there could be like implications on these U.S. brands that are trying to sell abroad as well. But in there they are over there, they're competing with obviously the local manufacturing as well. So
yeah, that's right. And I guess one other piece too is that the Canadian government has put forwards, or at least initiated talks to put tariffs together that are not that dissimilar to what the States has put forwards recently. Yeah. But I did want to bring up, it's interesting because as you were talking, I thought about it and your experience in Jordan and my experience traveling, right? Yeah. Both of our experiences traveling a lot. It's interesting when you think about the quantity of American vehicles that you see in American brands, right, around the world, as opposed to potentially like brands from parts of Asia.
Yeah, true.
And the impression I get is that, just having traveled as widely as I have, is that American manufacturers tend to focus their markets as North America.
That's right.
And almost exclusively North America. Like it's super rare to see like a Ford vehicle or a GM vehicle in Europe to an extent, but definitely in Asia.
Yeah, fair enough.
Right?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in the Middle East it's been the last visit I was about a year ago, and so I think that was we talked a little bit about this, but I think it's interesting to see that Teslas, there were some Teslas in the market. I think mostly the ones we would see in Jordan were supposedly not necessarily brand new. So a lot of people it's a secondary market for people who are selling their Teslas abroad and they bring them to that market. But then on the other hand, we see a ton of cars from China, like BYD being one of them, they have showrooms. They're widely available. We also see a lot of VWs, for example, but they're actually VWs that are manufactured in China that make it to the Middle Eastern market. So even though it's a German, brand, I guess. The manufacturing in China goes to these secondary markets, let's say.
Okay.
And so it's interesting to see the dynamic there, where they have access to all these brands at all different prices, and the government, for some reason or another, my guess is some type of sustainability initiative, is reducing the vehicle tax or whatever it is when you buy a car, so that when you buy an electric car, it's virtually not, very, very little. But when you buy a car with a combustion engine, it is 50 or 100%. So they're really incentivizing electric. And so Jordan now, it's there's so many electric vehicles.
Yeah.
A lot of brands I've never even heard of. Many are from kind of across Asia. So it's interesting to see in that. I don't know if I want to call it a free market, where you have the opportunity to import, export, kind of whatever, is just seeing the diversity in the cars that are there versus here, where, we live in Vancouver. There is a Tesla probably out of every 5 cars, there's a Tesla.
Yeah, it's probably a reasonable ratio.
And I wonder I wonder what that risk is on the consumers. Maybe, I know we often talk about the consumer at the end, but just to touch on this now, what is the impact to the consumer in the U.S. or Canada when the U.S. and Canada are blocking the optionality? So we only have access to cars from certain manufacturers. What is that? What do you think that causes or will cause?
It may delay a adoption of electric vehicles, right? Because it's going to be, if we're creating these kinds of trade barriers effectively between North America and Asia, then that is putting in that's interrupting the free market, right? And that's cutting off a sizable portion of supply from the complete market that could exist. So I think then it's really contingent on how fast American and Canadian manufacturer and Mexican manufacturing can scale up alongside, and one of the bigger questions is there going to be all of this demand out there? So far that is more or less true. But
I guess also with that supply thing, if there was more supply coming from different locations, then those companies are probably going to be more aggressive at competing on other dimensions, maybe including price, which if price is lowered, then the demand could also get increased because people think it's going to be more accessible.
There are a few of these dimensions that will have implications for consumers, but I think overall by diluting the free market kind of principles, that in general are the World Trade Organization kind of principles that have been agreed to by most countries, I think it in the broad sense is probably to the detriment of consumers.
Yeah, and potentially the adoption, which then is sustainability as well, this shift to electric vehicles.
Yeah,
that's interesting. Okay, so maybe moving on a little bit, around the tariffs that we just talked about. like what implications do we see or expect to see outside of EVs? I know we touched a little bit on solar. Are there other things that we expect to see that obviously are related to kind of climate sustainability and how it relates to the trade barriers that we're seeing?
It's obviously hard to say, but the bottom line is that there's a signal that's been put forwards by, in particular, by the United States. Canada has signaled its intent that it may follow whatever that signal is like. And so it's kind of the start of creating what conceivably can be larger and larger trade barriers, right? And so I think that can expand to all sorts of different sectors, like cross-cutting the economy in terms of what that looks like.
True. And so that signal makes companies think twice before investing in something or making a certain decision to ramp up production somewhere. And like I guess it really is. And I guess maybe to that the next question I had was around like companies. So what are companies likely going to do, or how will they change maybe their behavior based on these decisions that are being made, like at the trade level?
Yeah, I guess
how does a decision at the policy level, I guess, trickle down to the company level?
Right. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking through it. Those kinds of it's hard to say, because I really start to think about the clean manufacturing stuff almost strictly in terms of EVs, which is not the way to think about it. But I guess similarly, in a sense, to the consumer base, right? If we want to, let's say, scale up the deployment of solar technology, let's just use that as an example, across North America, across Canada, across the States, then by putting these different kind of by implementing these tariffs, by continuing these tariffs, we are preventing the widespread adoption of that kind of technology in as fast of a pace as we can, we can move it.
Possible.
Yeah.
And I think with companies, the thing I keep thinking about is like having worked at bigger corporates and like seeing the global kind of implications of some of these decisions. It's like, these signals like often mark like a decision or decisions by leadership, maybe influence decisions by leadership to be like, oh, like we should actually think twice before making this decision. In our case, it was like expanding into a market or getting out of a market. And those decisions, like even in markets where they're already making money, they're now really thinking twice about like doubling down on a market and or exiting a market. And so I think it's like the signals, the policy signals from government have this like interesting implication, I think, on some companies. And I saw it obviously with some of the e-commerce work that
and it's also interesting. I want to bring up another kind of policy instrument that I think we've also talked about briefly before, but just kind of the term policy instrument and that applied to tariffs as, in a sense, trade barriers. I mean, I think that is accurate because that is a country and its political entities putting forward something to effectively trade in that country. And it's coming from a variety of different, intents, but I think the bottom line, a lot of it being geopolitics and what the relationship is of that country. So let's just use the United States relative to China, right? Yeah. But then we have this other policy instrument that's also trade related, but it's coming from a very, very different intent, and that's carbon border adjustment mechanisms, right? Or the shorthand for it, I don't know who came up with this, but it's CBAM.
CBAM.
It's very...
Sounds like a name of a band.
CBAM sounds like the name of a band.
CBAM.
I don't know.
Or C-SPAN. I don't know.
No. I don't think anybody should name the band C-SPAN. C-SPAN's taken a number of names already. There's a lot of C-SPAN companies.
Fair enough.
Anyways. So the intent of a carbon border adjustment mechanism is for goods that are carbon intensive. So let's just say cement or steel is a better example. Carbon border adjustment mechanism is created so the European Union is the first set of countries to really trial this, and they are trialing it right now. Right, this started being piloted in October 2023, and what it means is that if another country, so let's say Canada, is sending some of Canadian-made steel to the European Union, the Canadian manufacturer has to show that steel is or has paid a carbon price similar to the entity that would have paid it in the EU had it been produced in the European Union. And so it's creating a whole other kind of trade-related mechanism, but it's all through the lens and the intent of addressing emissions, right?
That's cool. I actually think that's really interesting because then, like, in the past, you would compete on price, but then one country's like production habits were really negative for the environment, and were able to maybe cut down price significantly or cost significantly, and then send those goods abroad without any any negative implications. Whereas now with this, actually that's it. So what was the policy called? The EU policy called?
CBAM.
CBAM. But what does it stand for?
The Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism.
Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Yeah, that's actually super. I think that's super fascinating. That makes a lot of sense. Where I think something like that, for example, makes more sense than like the tariffs that are being implemented.
Yeah.
Because then like we want the stuff that's good for sustainability and climate. Like we want the adoption of EVs. Sure, China's going to be competitive, but like how do we, in a sense, level the playing field by doing things like that? I think that's a much more interesting,
Well, and it's funny
idea.
because,
but obviously, we'll see what happens with this pilot.
Yeah, and it's funny because this is how politics sometimes plays a role in this too, right? Because the EU in general, from a political standpoint, on climate issues, is more progressive than a lot of other kind of jurisdictions around the world. And so it is kind of like almost, expected, or it's like, it's not unexpected that they would adopt or put forwards a mechanism with climate at its core, right? Whereas it could be that, and let's say the tariffs were applied to carbon intensive goods in China, that the US implemented tariffs on carbon intensive goods from China, but they would implement it from we want to protect American manufacturing
because of the political signal that sends
and so
to voters.
this is why it becomes really interesting to look at all of this stuff through the climate lens, being like, well, does it matter where this is driven from as long as it results in reduced emissions overall?
I think that it. I mean, I don't know. I think this is what frustrates me. I think about all the climate stuff, because it's like at the end of the day, we want the stuff that's good, the stuff that's going to be positive for the climate, to just be implemented. But the reality is that I know, we as in me, I guess. But the reality is that there's all these like really complicated, especially I think the policy and the policy or politics and policy stuff is the stuff that I find like the most frustrating.
Yeah.
Because it's the stuff that has the most impact, but it's really like not often done for the direct benefit of climate. It's done for all these ulterior motives. And in your mind, that's totally fine. But in my mind, I'm like, just we want someone who's progressive who could make that link. I don't know. That's my take on it.
Admittedly, I guess I just don't mind, because I've been looking at this stuff for such a long time, and so I try and figure out exactly what the driver is for a lot of this stuff. But ultimately, if it results in that positive impact, then what do I care where it comes from?
I know. I just feel like I think maybe government needs to also just be better at like storytelling and or like on the sustainability or climate side, where like here's a policy, here's a bit of like the bullet points or narrative around how this not only will help the economy, maybe jobs, etc., but also climate. Actually make that part of the narrative, like part of the story, which I think is important. That's often missing.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a really interesting point, because somewhat in the vein, actually, of the way that these tariffs were established on EVs, right? At the same time, because of largely the Inflation Reduction Act, we've had to scale up in American manufacturing of EVs and Canadian manufacturing as a result, right? One of the bigger deals that was signed recently, there were a few, was the one by Honda, right, in Ontario. And I actually saw this is true. This is this morning. I found an advertisement of Ontario, and this is a Government of Ontario ad that's been circulated. I don't know if it's been on TV yet. I'll have to ask my parents. That says Ontario, the place to build, which is a classic kind of classic. This is the way that the Ontario government has positioned itself since the last government has been elected. But it also says where one of the cleanest electricity grids in North America, right? And that is in an advertisement that you will see on television.
Okay, that's cool.
But the really interesting thing is the government that put this forwards is a conservative government in Ontario, right? They're the ones who effectively put the money into this type of advertisement. And interestingly enough, they are also one of the governments who challenged the Trudeau government on carbon pricing in the first place, right? They canceled one of the original big carbon pricing mechanisms in Ontario when they were elected. It was 2018, I think it was. So it's really, so exactly to my point, it's really interesting to see, where all of this stuff comes from or has come from and what the driver is for it. But at the end of the day, I'm happy to see that Ontario is positioning themselves that way.
Yeah, I think that's good. So maybe Canada-wide.
Yeah.
We talked a bit about Ontario. I don't know if you have any other thoughts on more like Canada-wide implications of this, either the tariff decision and or it's like the relationships with the U.S. and the Inflation Reduction Act. Like kind of that dynamic, let's say the trade barriers with China, but while the U.S. is also investing in some of its own climate and sustainability stuff, like what's Canada's role? Honda, like this Honda plant in Ontario is I believe a pretty huge deal.
Yeah. Well, and there was also the Stellantis announcement. There was also a Volkswagen announcement, right,
Okay.
a few years ago that were somewhat similar in nature to what Honda has put forwards. I mean, what Canada stands to gain, and I spoke about Ontario. Ontario has been the bedrock of manufacturing in Canada. Okay. And so I think that region in particular is the one that stands the most to gain from the manufacturing lens from the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act, I can't remember if it was that piece of legislation itself that included Canada. What I do know with certainty is that Canada forced itself into the revised NAFTA, right?
Okay.
NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Which is now like
that was
USMCA
so
or
the
something.
acronym for this is USMCA.
Yeah.
But interestingly, so it's called the USMCA in the States because it's US, Canada, Mexico agreement.
Yeah.
In Canada, it's called CUSMA or CUSMA, Canada, US, Mexico.
I did not know that.
Agreement, which is the same. It is literally the same agreement that has two different names. But I think I like the U.S. naming better because the way that I think about it, it's U.S. macaw. So it really just works to the benefit of people who are fans of birds.
Yeah. I think
the avian community,
the avian
if you will.
community, the macaw population.
Yeah, it really calls out to the avian community.
Folks.
It's really important to me. Anyway,
all right, back on track.
Yeah. So Canada kind of inserted itself into those kinds of negotiations in the sense that it wanted to gain benefit from a trade perspective if the U.S. were to pass XYZ type of legislation, and I think it was to do with scaling manufacturing. So I am not a trade expert, to be clear, but I think the vein of all of that is true.
Yeah.
So
you're not a trade expert, but you have another question about this trade stuff because it is the topic of today's episode.
I have another question about.
I have another question about it. So this is what we're talking about today. This example with the U.S. and China, tariffs on EVs and other things related to climate.
Yep.
Have we seen? And you did mention the CBAM and the EU. Is there any other examples like that where
just emphasis on the BAM?
The BAM. Is there any other examples like that where a country or countries have implemented like tariffs that we have? Like, is there like existing case studies that this is based on?
So I mean, I think one of the more recent ones was, and it is trade related, and it also resulted from geopolitics, was a change in the EU's purchase of energy products from Russia.
True.
Right?
Yeah,
so I actually don't know which would have happened first. Russia maybe cutting off pipelines versus the EU saying we don't want to import from Russia. I don't think it really matters. I mean, effectively a trade barrier was put up in general. And what's really interesting in that case is that one of the things I think there's two big pieces that have happened for that. The first is that has forced the European Union to scale up their generation of renewable electricity to be able to support end uses that otherwise would have used natural gas.
So you used to get natural gas for Europe mainly from Russia.
Yeah, okay. A sizable portion of natural gas was coming from Russia to Europe. And so that's kind of changed that dynamic completely. The other thing that it's done somewhat similarly is the EU has then started to pursue energy security and seeking natural gas from other sources, and in particular liquefied natural gas from a variety of other places, including the biggest place that they're sourcing it from right now, I believe, is the United States.
Okay, I see.
Yeah.
So yeah, building like that's almost like that supply chain resiliency aspect
Yeah.
to where they're getting their energy from, and I guess even in the case of the other stuff we're talking about, there's like where people are getting their products from.
Yeah.
Kind of not relying on one country to source, either products or materials, but spreading that out.
Yeah,
to
and
reduce that-
so
to
it's a
build that
real
resilience.
it's a real kind of like paradigm change in terms of the liberalization of trade, right? And a push for free trade across the world, and you can get all of this stuff from everywhere whenever you want it all the time. That is still true, don't get me wrong,
Yeah.
but there's pushback against it, right?
So maybe to that point,
Yeah.
because I don't know much about like you did mention this before, which is like something about the World Trade Agreement. Is that
World Trade Organization.
Sorry,
Yeah.
that's what I meant. WTO.
Yes. Not WTF.
Yeah. How does that connect to all of this? I mean, maybe a quick primer on WTO first, because I don't know very much about the World Trade Organization.
Sure.
But I know it exists.
Yes.
And so then what and I actually do remember, funny enough, like in my past career in e-commerce, we did a lot of cross-border stuff. And so a lot of the, I wasn't involved with it, but technically a lot of the stuff we looked at in e-commerce, there was like a back-end system that calculated tariffs on all these products that we were sending across the border. I barely looked into it. I have gone to the WTO website. I can confirm at least one time in my life for that purpose for my last job. But that's all I know about it. And so I'm guessing, what's the implication of all these trade agreements and tariffs and things that are happening, trade wars, and what is the World Trade Organization actually like meant to be doing about all this stuff?
Right. So I think it was after World War II. There was a creation of what's known as the GATT, or the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And that kind of broadly, and I haven't, again, I will put
Not
the
a trade
caveat out there,
expert.
I'm not a trade expert. But my
You
understanding
know more
was,
than I do. That's plenty.
do I? But that, my understanding, was kind of the foundation for a lot of the free trade that we see today, because the General Agreement on tariffs and trade then kind of evolved into the organization that is the World Trade Organization. So the World Trade Organization helps deploy free trade kind of around the world. I was reading about this, like they do a review of the policies of what they term as significant countries, and there's a list of 10 like very significant trading countries, the US being one of them, China being one of them. They do a review of those kind of every year. They do a review of like a lot of like minor countries in a trade sense every few years, like that kind of thing. They also handle trade disputes. So when it actually comes to this, the EV tariffs, China, I think I can't remember if it's for the EV tariffs or if it's for other tariffs, clean manufacturing tariffs in any case. China is putting forwards a complaint to the World Trade Organization, saying that the States is not treating Chinese-made goods equally.
Okay.
And
So there is this entity that's trying to like...
Yeah. There is this entity, but this is one of the challenges of multilateral institutions like the World Trade Organization. Like, okay, you put forwards a complaint, and then let's say the United States decides, we just don't like the World Trade
like what's the
Organization
enforcement around that? Yeah, there's not really. It's just
because I don't know. I don't even know if this would be legislatively possible. But hypothetically, let's say the U.S. pulled out of the World Trade World Trade Organization. They would still, I'm assuming, they would still have the USMCA.
Okay,
USMCA.
Yeah.
My bad. They would have the USMCA.
The trade agreements.
They would have other trade agreements, right? They're part of another like Asia Pacific trade agreement. I don't know if there probably is some relationship between the two, but I imagine like they could also potentially work in isolation, like one without the other. So USMCA working without the World Trade Organization.
Fair enough.
But it would be to the detriment of the United States. And it would be to the detriment of, I think, the ability of the States to export things all over the world.
So it'd be a matter of like trying to like figure out, maybe they put this tariff out, like they keep this tariff, they get the complaints, they like then just deal with the complaints. Kind of like that thing of like asking for forgiveness, not permission, right? Like ultimately, like you kind of do it. It helps them from a policy perspective, from a political perspective, and they kind of work back. So tying this a little bit now back to the climate implications, it sounds like, at least maybe this is a small, kind kind of window into, I don't know if what's to come or if this is the end of it, who knows, but this kind of like almost like fragmentation of the trade that's happening, maybe countries being more like nationalistic, focusing on like local production, local manufacturing. What do we expect, I guess, or what are the current implications that that's going to have on adoption of climate solutions? Like, I know we touched that already, but like any other thoughts on like how much is this going to take us back in our kind of in this game we're trying to play and of actually making people adopt these solutions, like solar, heat pumps, EVs, all this stuff?
I think in the broad sense it just might delay, like, let's say an innovation is identified in China that is game changing for whatever reason, is completely game changing from a climate perspective, and then the North American kind of countries decide like, well, we have these trade barriers up, we don't like kind of the way that China has been putting forwards all of their stuff like super cheaply into North America. It's to our detriment. So we don't care about that innovation. That is just going to, it's going to stop the deployment of, or not stop. It's going to slow the deployment of climate solutions, right? Which I think is just going to be problematic overall.
Yeah, and I guess on the business side, then, at least for local, like for at least in maybe Canada, the U.S. I guess there is some benefit in the sense maybe more in the short term for businesses, because I guess in that case they're maybe being protected from these outside like manufacturers.
That's true. Yeah, and so some of these,
I guess I'm trying to like look at both sides here
and that's true. I mean, some of these measures are termed as protectionist, right? And we did talk about, right, the intent of some of this legislation being literally the protection of manufacturing in North America, or like the reshoring or friendshoring, which means like bringing it back to like a friendly neighboring country of those manufacturing jobs that were exported to, as an example, China, like over the past number of decades, right? So like
there is some benefit. Maybe some financial benefit for those companies, which I guess trickles down to like tax benefits for the country, and then maybe like the jobs that you touched on that as well, like the hiring or rehiring of people in those sectors as well.
Yeah, that's right. So I think there are. I'm just trying to think if there can be any climate specific benefits.
So it sounds like the benefits are more on the economic side.
Yeah, that's right.
The detriment is like the adoption.
Oh, shocking! Look at that. We have a contrast between climate and economy
and
sometimes.
Money. Yeah, exactly. And so it's interesting, I guess. Yeah, that is a bit of the battle when like these policies, are kind of bringing things back a little bit on the climate front, but then maybe helping the economy for a while. And I guess the big question is this just like a small blip, or is this really like the start of something much bigger? And that's going to get worse and worse over time. I guess that's the big thing.
Yeah. I don't know. I hope not.
Yeah. So as we often kind of finish up, we talk about like the individual consumer, or like, household, let's say, in the coming years, let's say, like, what do you expect all this stuff to actually have an impact on them? Like, I know we talked about like solar, EVs. I don't know if like the heat pump stuff is in the mix. Like, do we get a lot of that locally or from abroad? Like, what do you expect to see, or the impact on individuals?
The way I like to think about or visualize it, so I think we're going to see more labels that are made in Canada or made in the United States. Or potentially made to somewhat of a lesser extent, made in Mexico. I think we're going to see less of those labels as made in different parts of Asia, in particular, made in China. And when I say labels, I mean, like different brands and like broadly applicable, right? And so EVs, I think, electric vehicles being the best example of that. It's interesting because I'm thinking, I'm like, I don't even know if I would really like that all of those trade barriers would come down. I'm not entirely sure. I'm just thinking of like if there was a proliferation of BYD like across North America. And I'm just thinking from the perspective of a Canadian who's worked across Canada. I'm like, well, that could actually be to the detriment of Canadian and American manufacturing. Do I want that? I mean, that's not the outcome that I want.
That's a good point. And I think that's actually interesting because it's ultimately about that balance, right? Like, yes, we want that like global knowledge sharing around policy, around trade, around products.
Yeah.
But yes, ultimately, like I do think we've also spoken about this extensively in the past. Like we want people to keep their jobs and like figure out how to upskill and actually have competitive manufacturing here in those sectors. That's not only even serving Canada, but maybe being imported into the U.S. and globally. And then I think for consumers, that aspect of benefiting from like having those consumers that are working for those companies still have a job and be able to contribute to our tax system.
Yeah.
But at the same time, live in a country where there's enough competition where you can have like access to a reasonably priced EV
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So before we wrap up, I guess my question to you is like, what are your thoughts on buying an EV? What are you gonna get one after this episode, or are you gonna wait?
Listen. Okay, as a number of people know, I've created a spreadsheet, and I've looked at this spreadsheet over the last 6 years in terms of the cost benefit analysis of buying different vehicles. Mm-hmm. From a lifestyle standpoint, I do not feel the need for an EV.
Yeah.
So I actually, this is a complete side note, but I think something that's very much lost in the sustainability conversation is the very fundamentals, the foundation of sustainability being the 3 R's. Do you know what the 3 R's are?
Reuse, reduce, recycle.
That is correct. Wow, I am shocked that you got those right.
Yes.
But the interesting thing is they're in an order of hierarchy.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
It is reduce, then reuse, then recycle. Okay. So my personal take is I am on the side of reduce first. So I don't need a vehicle.
That's a good point, because ultimately it's probably better for the climate if you don't get a car than if you get an EV car.
Yeah.
So that's.
But to answer your question more specifically, if I were in the position of needing a vehicle, I think there's just too many factors at play.
So next episode we'll just
depends
do
on
car.
the user.
We're gonna do,
you've experienced.
Yeah. So next episode we'll just do car reviews.
This is 100% true. When we've been driving together, and I've been in the passenger seat occasionally, and then we drive by a vehicle. We've done that. We've done it twice at least,
true.
right? With the Rivian and with the Toyota BZ4X. My instinct has always been, please roll down the window. I want to talk to that driver about their user
experience with this car. That is factual. I have refused to open the window in those cases.
And now I don't know.
But now you don't know.
So I can't make a good decision.
Right. Like I said, we'll probably wrap up this season with just like a full EV market or electric vehicle review comparison.
We should just do test drives. We should do episodes of test drives.
Eco Echoes.
We get this whole setup mobile.
I like it.
It's just embedded onto every vehicle.
Oh God. Okay. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to stay focused on more of these fun climate topics where I get to learn something new.
Wait, hold on.
And then we'll start a new channel. We'll start a new channel for car reviews.
You asked me that question, so I'm going to ask you the same question.
So I actually have thought about this a lot. Like I every time I think about buying a car, again, I'm similar to you where I always feel like it's just at that like tipping point where I don't really need it, but like it maybe would be nice and more of a nice to have, and so I've always resisted. But I do think if I was to buy a car, like EVs are definitely at the top of like my that is a big driver of like a vehicle I would drive. Like it would definitely be like I'd be looking at EVs and hybrids first for sure before looking at other types of vehicles. And very likely EV. But again, like the optionality now is interesting because it's like if you're looking at kind of the entry level vehicles, there's very clear competitors. But again, having been in the Middle East, I can see that there's also like there's a whole tier of EVs that we actually don't see at all in Canada.
I want to know the user experience of a BYD.
No, but exactly, of a BYD and all those cars that are actually like in the 20,000 range.
These tariffs are preventing me this.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what we learned today. Awesome. Thanks so much for your time, Sheldon. Really appreciate it. And thanks to you. UBC Sauder Centre for Business and Climate Solutions.
The UBC Centre for
Climate
and Business
Solutions for having us as well. Thank you.